Okay, thank you all for being here. My name is Larry Rosenthal. I'm the director of the Center for the Comparative Study of Right-Wing Movements. And today we're going to have a talk by Jennifer Burns on her book, Goddess of the Market, Ayn Rand and the American Right. Our co-sponsors for this event include the Charles and Louise Travers Department of Political Science, the Beatrice Bain Research Group, the Department of Gender and Women's Studies, the Undergraduate Political Science Association, and the History Department. This is the last of our series of talks for this semester. If you'd like to hear about our fall 2011 events, please add your email address to the sheet that's being passed around. Let's see. Please turn your cell phones off. You still got to ask that. Strange. Okay. What we're going to do is Jennifer will speak for about 50 minutes. Afterwards, we'll open up things for discussion and take questions from the audience. We will try to end at about 1:20, which will leave time for people to purchase the book and have it signed by Jennifer Burns. I can't help but think that Ayn Rand is ever with us, and especially this week when a movie version of Atlas Shrugged opened on Tax Day, part 1 of 3. The part of the Tea Party that's most libertarian in its outlook, Freedom Works, is said to have sent out 1 million emails about the opening of the Atlas Shrugged film. So the currency of Ayn Rand is about as active as it could be. Jennifer is the assistant professor in the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia. She teaches courses on American politics, cultural and intellectual history. She graduated Harvard University in history and received her master's and PhD here at UC Berkeley. She's the author of Goddess of the Market, and that will be the topic for today. Professor Burns has been a guest lecturer at Harvard, Columbia Business School, UC Berkeley, UC Santa Barbara, Rice, and the Cato Institute. In 2010, she was honored as a distinguished lecturer by the Organization of American Historians. And with that, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Burns.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me all right? I'm kind of a moving target when I talk, so if I wander away from the microphone and you can't hear me, just give a wave. So thank you for that very generous introduction. As Dr. Rosenthal mentioned, I did my PhD here at Berkeley from 2001 and 2005. And I was one of the few doctoral students that I knew of interested in this kind of topic, interested in conservatism, interested in things on the right. And so I had a certain degree of isolation while doing it. And so coming back today, I'm just delighted there's something called the Center for the Comparative Study of Right-Wing Movements. I think that's really, really wonderful, and I'm really honored to be back here and to give an example of what one can do at Berkeley on the right. People may not believe it, but it can be done. So before I get started, I want to preemptively answer a question I get all the time, which is, how do you pronounce the name of the subject of your book? So I'm here to tell you a good trick. The way you pronounce it is Ayn Rand, and the way to remember that is in keeping with her philosophy. The correct pronunciation of her name, Ayn, rhymes with the word mine. So today I'm going to talk primarily about Rand's relationship to libertarianism. And in addition to being grateful for the idea that there's more community around the study of the right, I'm thrilled about this center for another reason, which is the fact that it's not a study of comparative conservatisms, but it's a study of comparative right-wing movements. Because I think we should be talking less about conservatism and more about the right. And I think talking about the right brings us into a more comparative context that can be very illuminating and enlightening. So today I'm going to talk primarily about Rand's relationship to libertarianism. In the Q&A, I'd be happy to expand on the other themes that the topic of Ayn Rand brings up. That would be my focus. A monstrous, disgusting bunch of people. Plagiarizers. Scum. Hippies of the right. These were a few of the insults Ayn Rand hurled at libertarians when they emerged as an independent political movement and party in the 1970s. Yet as I show in my book, Goddess of the Market, Ayn Rand and the American Right, her work inspired the emergence of an independent libertarian movement in America. Even now, more than 20 years after her death, she remains popular among libertarians. Her 1957 novel, Atlas Shrugged, is as close to a Bible as anything for the Tea Party movement. So what I want to do today is explore this animosity and this affinity. I also want to lay out some arguments about how Rand influenced the American right. I'm going to make three primary arguments. The first is that we should consider Rand the ultimate gateway drug to life on the right. By this, I'll expand more, but she was the thinker who got people interested in free market economics, limited government, anti-statism. From Rand, they went on to other places, but she drew them in. Second argument is that Rand's work was a primary catalyst for the emergence of an independent libertarian movement in the 1970s. And finally, I want to argue that her popularity among libertarians, particularly her emphasis on capitalism, ensured that libertarianism remained an ideology of the right, not of the left. Now, the title of my book was chosen deliberately, Ayn Rand and the American Right. Throughout the book, I juxtapose Rand to conservatives, but I don't call her a conservative. I believe that her atheism, her emphasis on ethical selfishness, and more generally, her orientation to the future make it impossible to categorize her as a conservative. So what I do is I place her on this broader category of the American right. By doing so, I want to draw attention to a bigger and more dynamic ideological field that encompasses but is not limited to conservatives. By this, I want to draw our attention to libertarians, anarcho-capitalists, classical liberals, free marketers, objectivists, and I see this ideological field unified and drawn together by a few key commitments to individualism, to limited government, to personal and economic liberty. And I think this term, the right, as I said, gives us better connections to a comparative perspective and really gives us a better sense of what's going on. Now, some readers of my book have objected to putting Rand on the right, saying, properly understood, Ayn Rand transcends all ideological categories. I can see the thrust of the argument there, but historically speaking, Rand's ideas and her presence kept libertarianism on the right, not the left. And this is tremendously important to our recent political history. So let me begin with the basics. Who is Ayn Rand? She was born Elisa Rosenbaum in 1905 in Petrograd, Russia. There's an early picture of her with her two sisters. She was the eldest child. As you can tell, she came from a relatively prosperous family. They've got curled hair, bows in their hair, and they're in a professional portrait studio. Now, the affluence and comfort that her family enjoyed would all change with the coming of the Bolshevik Revolution. And I'm going to read here from the first paragraph of my book, which takes you to this moment. It was a wintry day in 1918 when the Red Guard pounded on the door of Zinovy Rosenbaum's chemistry shop. The guards bore a seal of the state of Russia, which they nailed upon the door, signaling it had been seized in the name of the people. Zinovy could at least be thankful the mad whirl of revolution had taken only his property, not his life. But his oldest daughter, Elisa, 12 at the time, burned with indignation. The shop was her father's. He had worked for it, studied long hours at university, dispensed valued advice and medicines to his customers. Now in an instant it was gone, taken to benefit nameless, faceless peasants, strangers who could offer her father nothing in return. The soldiers had come in boots, carrying guns, making clear that resistance would mean death. Yet they had spoken the language of fairness and equality, their goal to build a better society for all. Watching, listening, absorbing, Elisa knew one thing for certain. Those who invoked such lofty ideals were not to be trusted. Talk about helping others was only a thin cover for force and power. It was a lesson she would never forget. Now, from this moment on, the Rosenbaum family lost the place they had in pre-revolutionary society. They lost their livelihood. They tumbled to a life of poverty, living close to the edge of starvation at times. And before long, Elisa decided she had to get out of Russia. So I'm going to fast forward a bit because most of it's in the book. I talk about her emigration to America, aided by distant relatives who already lived in Chicago. The struggle of her early years when she settled in Hollywood, working a series of odd jobs and always writing a variety of things, screenplays, short stories, novels. I discuss how she achieved lasting fame with The Fountainhead, a bestseller published in 1943 that was then made into a movie in 1949 with Gary Cooper and Patricia Neal, as you see. This is the Hollywood take. No man takes what's mine. And what I do in my book is really try to give not so much the Hollywood take that you see here, a dramatic story of love and lust and ambition, but I try to go beneath the surface and show just how political these works were. Now here, my work in the Ayn Rand archive was really key. The Ayn Rand archive is privately held. I was the first scholar to get in there who's not an official objectivist, to have pretty much free reign to examine her writings, her diaries, the development of her thought. And so it enabled me to really trace the evolution in her self-concept and in her goals. A key moment for this was her work on the 1940 presidential campaign of Wendell Willkie. As the New Deal unfolded in the United States, she saw it all through the prism of what had happened to her family in Russia, and she became convinced that Roosevelt had to be stopped. So she signed up to volunteer for Wendell Willkie. And I traced the sort of transformation that working for the Willkie campaign had in her thought, primarily in giving her more faith than she'd had before in the prospect of American democracy, and reducing somewhat the elitism that had characterized her earlier thought. Willkie's campaign also gave her a new ambition. As she wrote to somebody after the campaign, she wanted to become the, quote, John Steinbeck of the right. And The Fountainhead, which was only half written when she began working in the Willkie campaign, is threaded through with these ideas about the dangers of government, the need for individualism. And so my book looks into this drafting experience, early fundraising letters she wrote for a political organization that never got off the ground, and really explains how explicitly political was the context in which Rand wrote The Fountainhead, and then attempted to market it as a piece of propaganda for her side. So in light of all this, it's not surprising that she became a presence on the American right. It was absolutely what she wanted to do. I think the more interesting question is, how did she affect the American right? What role did she play in its formation in the 20th century? So in my book, I detail her connections to seminal figures like the anarchist Murray Rothbard, the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, the conservative organizer William F. Buckley. She knew everybody, and she pretty much got into a fight with everybody. One of her most famous and long-running conflicts was with William F. Buckley, Jr. In 1957, his magazine, National Review, published, it's gone down to become a famous poison pen review in American literary history, Whittaker Chambers on Atlas Shrugged, in an article entitled, "Big Sister is Watching You." And in Atlas Shrugged, Rand promoted selfishness as key to capitalism. Whittaker Chambers, having converted from his previous communism, was an advocate of capitalism, but he was appalled by Rand's atheistic viewpoint. It was religion that was necessary to fight the Cold War, and Rand got it all wrong. So conservatives were for capitalism, but not of the kind Rand espoused. She took it too far. But I want to shift focus here and talk about Rand's impact on the rank and file, the ordinary readership, rather than the elites who met her and who disliked her, because their censure did little to discourage people from reading Rand. In fact, it had almost entirely the opposite effect. National Review published this angry article on Rand in 1957. They did another one in 1961, another one in 1967, and then another one just last year. So it's a sort of repeated theme, and it's done little to dent her appeal. So in terms of Rand's influence on the rank and file, as I said, one of the best metaphors I came up with for understanding the impact Rand had on her readers was this idea of her as a gateway drug to the American right. A thinker who brought people into the movement, brought people into awareness. And I chose this metaphor deliberately for all its connotations because there is a sort of feverishness and intensity about the encounter with Ayn Rand that is really, in many ways, unique to her. Here's a fan letter I found from a young reader, which is fairly typical. Writes to her, quote, "About a month ago, I noticed how much I was talking about your books to my teachers and classmates. As a result of my enthusiasm, I have lost 2 friends. I am beginning to realize how unimportant these people are." Now, this encounter with Rand was often marked not necessarily by fractured personal relationships, but it was often marked also by political activism. And you see this particularly in the conservative youth movement, Young Americans for Freedom, and you really see it in the 1964 Goldwater campaign. And it's a pattern that we're seeing again today with the emergence of the Tea Party. Atlas Shrugged tends to be a book that fills its readers with a sense of mission and motivates them to join movements or groups or try to proselytize for the set of ideas they encounter within it. Now, in the 1960s, the ideas that Rand promulgated were promoted primarily by the Nathaniel Branden Institute. Here's an ad from the Nathaniel Branden Institute from the New York Times. This was an educational institution started by Rand's best student and also her secret extramarital lover, Nathaniel Branden. And they would start lecture courses in New York. It started with lectures in New York. Come here, a lecture on the philosophy of your favorite novelist, and she'll answer questions after. And pretty soon they got the idea to do tape transcription. So we might gather here in Berkeley, someone would press play on the tape recorder, and everyone would sit and listen to these lectures and transcribe them. So it was sort of podcasting before its day. And through the Nathaniel Branden Institute, there really grew up a whole subculture around objectivism, Rand's philosophy. Here's a conference organized in 1967 at the university where I teach, the Ayn Rand Society of the University of Virginia, held in Charlottesville. And through Rand's novels, she also had a newsletter, the Objectivist newsletter. She published a whole series of nonfiction, all of which repeated the pattern of Atlas Shrugged. Terrible critical reviews, astronomical sales. And she really created a subculture and identity around this philosophy, around her books. We might think of her as the first person to do the now familiar end run around the mainstream media and going right to the true believers or the faithful to spread the message. And what happened in 1968 is a rather sordid tale that I do cover in some detail in the book, when the extramarital affair she was having with Nathaniel Branden ended in the light of the revelation that he had yet another lover on the side. So 1968, the whole thing went up in flames. And it meant that this ideological energy that Rand was amassing and feeding through her works, it had to go somewhere else. NBI was closed down overnight, mysterious letters accusing people of unspecified crimes were mailed out to mailing lists, and that was the end of it. Where did people go from there? Well, as I discovered in my research, they went into what they called the libertarian movement. And using Rand's works, they were inspired for the first time to break away from the conservative organizations where they had previously made their home. I'm going to read another excerpt here from the book that talks about the development of the student right in the 1960s. So this is the moment after NBI has disappeared. Rand's ideas became a powerful current in the fast-running tides of the student right, referenced by a popular news symbol, the black flag of anarchy modified with a gold dollar sign. Broad reference to radical libertarianism, the flag had multiple meanings. The dollar sign, the totem of John Galt and Atlas Shrugged, was a clear allusion to Rand. Its juxtaposition on the flag of anarchy, however, indicated allegiances beyond Rand, usually to anarchism. Whatever its exact meaning, the black flag looked menacing to conventional conservatives as it spread beyond the objectivist subculture into the wider conservative movement. Reporting on a Southern California Young Americans for Freedom conference held in conjunction with Robert Lefebvre's radical libertarian Rampart College, a writer for the conservative newsletter Chalcedon Report was dismayed by what he found. Instead of studious conservatives affirming faith in God and country, the conference was filled with eccentrics waving black dollar sign flags. Enthusiastic libertarians debated proposals to create offshore tax havens and argued over the finer points of objectivist doctrine. Quote, "When the talk drifted into a debate over whether or not Reardon was the true hero of Atlas Shrugged, given the world in which we live, I left," the writer reported. He concluded, quote, "I think it is safe to say that YAF is drifting." And it was indeed drifting from the conservative point of view away from a conservatism into this more radical form of right-wing thought. Now, what is it that libertarians liked so much about Rand? What drew them to her? On the most basic level, it was a fictional presentation of an idealized capitalist world. She created an alternative universe, novels over 1,000 pages, where people could live, they could debate the finer points of the ins and outs of this universe. It was really, it's a dystopian text and a utopian text at once. Now, objectivist philosophy also presented individualism as an ethical value that you could organize your life around. Here's how Rand defined objectivism when challenged to do so in a press conference for Atlas Shrugged. And I'll just run through these 4 points so you have a sense of what objectivism encompasses. Objectivism teaches that, in keeping with its name, there is an objective, knowable reality, that reason is absolute, mankind's only guide to thought and action. It holds ethical selfishness as a moral ideal, and it teaches that free market capitalism is the only moral and practical social system. So, essentially, objectivism was a fully formed philosophy of the world, and it provided a sense that individualism could be the organizing principle of a cohesive understanding of the world. There was an objectivist theory of art, of politics, of sex, of music. It could really do anything. And how much of this was translated into the libertarian movement, what they pulled most prominently from Rand was this idea that it was evil to initiate force. So the ethical principle beyond individualism was the non-initiation of force as a basic social principle. And this was enshrined in the Libertarian Party's founding document. Now, all of these ideas began to form the basis of an independent libertarian identity, rather than a piece of the conservative movement. And this really came into focus in 1969 at the Young Americans for Freedom annual convention. This convention was rocked by a very active libertarian caucus that proposed a number of amendments, including the idea of removing young conservative from the mission statement, adding domestic statism as a menace equivalent to international communism, draft resistance, withdrawal from Vietnam, and the legalization of marijuana. Now, one by one, the caucus proposed these planks, and one by one, they went down to defeat. Eventually, it all bubbled over, and I'm going to read here another dramatic rendering of the denouement from the book. In the face of these insults, the libertarians could no longer resist their innate impulse to challenge authority. A small pack of students gathered in a conspiratorial knot. One of the group had a facsimile of his draft card. Apparently, the conservative within him lived still, for he was unwilling to sacrifice the actual card. Another dissident seized a microphone and announced to the assembly that any person had a right to defend himself against violence, including state violence. Then, quote, he raised a card, touched it with a flame from a cigarette lighter, and lifted it over his head while it burned freely into a curling ash. The symbol of Yath, a hand holding the torch of liberty, had been deftly satirized and openly mocked. After a few moments of shocked silence, pandemonium erupted on the convention floor. "Kill the commies!" yelled the patriotic majority. Amid shouts, shoving, and fisticuffs, the traitorous facsimile draft card burners were ejected from the convention floor. Around 300 of their ideological brethren followed the rebels out of the convention and out of Young Americans for Freedom. A chasm now separated the libertarians and the traditionalists. Now, from this moment on, then, we really see this emergence of the independent libertarian movement. And if this is true, if it was readers of Rand who were the ones inspired to leave behind conservatism and move out, why did Rand hate them so much? Because as soon as libertarians began identifying themselves as libertarians and making clear that they read Atlas Shrugged and they admired Rand, she became enraged. And in almost every appearance throughout the 1970s, she would just ritually abuse libertarians and would not miss an opportunity to insult them in some of the very graphic and colorful ways I read at the start of this lecture. Now, she had three basic complaints. One was that they were plagiarizers. This was a difficulty with Rand, that anyone, advancing ideas in a sort of free market, classical liberal tradition could be open to being accused of plagiarism by her. So this is a sort of basic problem with Rand. But there was a more philosophical part to her objection, because she felt there needed to be a moral basis to the defense of capitalism. And this was really at the heart of her whole intellectual project. She was promoting an inversion of values, a la Nietzsche, to say selfishness was good. And if you didn't invert these values in this way, if you didn't place a strong ethical base at the foundation of your advocacy for capitalism, you would go wrong, because you still left open the possibility of altruism being used to undermine capitalism. So to advance capitalism without an ethical theory, specifically her ethical theory, which was conceived as an anti-altruistic, anti-Christian movement, that was to miss the point entirely. So that was the second of her ideas, and there was a robust debate within libertarianism itself whether Rand was right, whether you really did need to be an objectivist to be a good libertarian, but they pretty quickly lost that argument because Rand was so virulent in her hatred of libertarians. It was hard to continue defending her position when she wasn't giving anybody any room to do that. Now, the third objection that Rand had to libertarians was she considered them erroneously to be synonymous with anarchists. So she had first encountered anarchism through Murray Rothbard when she met him in New York in the 1950s, and she hated it ever since. She was an advocate of limited government. In the world of the right on the 60s and 70s, she was a minarchist. There were anarchists on one side and minarchists on the other, and she held up the idea of limited government. Now, this limited government would have three functions. It would be limited to national defense. It would have, because it held a lawful monopoly on force, it would be in charge of law enforcement, capturing criminals and wrongdoers, and it would set up a court system to uphold contracts. These were really the three legitimate uses of government, but she thought anarchism was simply beyond the pale. It was unworkable. You needed a state to ensure basic order and to basically help markets and help individual freedom function properly. And she assumed that all libertarians were anarchists. As I said, she's not right. But that Ayn Rand was considered moderate or conservative in the 1970s and 1960s, late 60s, tells you something about the pace of ideological evolution on the right in the late 60s and 1970s. She went from being a dangerous radical to being considered a hopeless conservative who didn't really get the problem of statism. Now, it's in the aftermath of the dissolution of NBI and the aftermath of the YAF convention where Rand's influence is truly felt. And libertarianism's anarchic energies, its interest in individual freedom, it gives it purchase on both the left and the right. But it was Rand's presence in modern libertarianism, the role she played as a gateway bringing people into the movement, that kept it on the right side of the spectrum. My research shows again and again that people went from objectivism into libertarianism, and they never quite moved away from this allegiance to Rand. So one of the first libertarian organizations was called the Society for Individual Liberty. Came out of a neo-objectivist group that Rand had tangled with, but one that called itself the Rational Individualist. There was an index of libertarian periodicals called A is A, again a reference to Rand's works. And I went through this whole series of them. They're all in the Hoover Archives down at Stanford. Out of 128 periodicals listed, 30 were objectivist. And the next closest was anarcho-capitalist. That was the next sort of open identification. So there's been a lot of argument that some people came to libertarianism from the left, that you can see libertarian traces on the New Left. And there was some effort to bring New Left students into the movement. And basically they would bump up against this issue of private property. And that would push them out. And you know, libertarians calling for withdrawal from Vietnam, calling for the legalization of marijuana might look a lot like hippies, but they were capitalists through and through. Because Galt's Gulch, once imagined, could never be forgotten. Once you had gone through Rand's utopia and envisioned this perfect world of rational capitalists moving together, you could never really get over it. It remained a deep imprint on the imagination. Now this is really significant because it's this imprinting of the idea of personal liberty and personal freedom with the ideals of capitalism, with the practice of private property, that made possible the Libertarian alliance with the Republican Party. Capitalism became the touchstone, and it allowed the GOP's rhetoric about markets, low taxation, a business-friendly climate to win the day among most libertarian voters. One can imagine an alternate scenario where the civil liberties side of libertarianism could have been attached to the rights revolution of the 1960s. Instead, it made its allegiance with free market economics and with economics over culture, and this is where it remains today. Now I want to close with a question of Rand's legacy. There's been a recent surge in popularity of Rand's work. Over 500,000 copies of Atlas Shrugged were sold in 2009. I'm going to go back to this slide. We start with this one. The movie of Atlas Shrugged just came out last Friday. And here's the poster, and it looks to me kind of like Atlas is holding up something that looks suspiciously like the Obama campaign logo. And this movie has been marketed as very much a sort of social event and an activist moment for people on the right. She's also become a favorite of the Tea Party. Here's a few emblematic signs from some of the Tea Party rallies in 2009. Now, I would say that it's probably not a good sign for the long-range future of the Tea Party that they're this excited about Ayn Rand if the Libertarian Party is any kind of example. Because the schismatic tendencies of Rand's life permeated libertarianism. The Libertarian Party inherited from Rand a fixity and a focus on purity, a desire to be right rather than be effective, persuasive, or noticed by anyone. As one libertarian activist suggested, in certain critical ways, Atlas Shrugged retarded the growth of libertarians. He wrote, quote, "Young libertarians were not so much influenced by Atlas as dominated by it. the book was much more powerful than they could absorb. To have read Atlas Shrugged out of the blue during one's formative years could be and often was a shattering experience, and not always a liberating one, to be frank about the matter. He went on to argue that Atlas Shrugged led libertarians to see the world in a distorted manner, to filter all politics through the fictional framework that Rand had created. And there's a critical problem with that. There are no elections in Atlas Shrugged. Rand was not particularly attentive to the workings of representative democracy. It wasn't something that particularly concerned her. And this made it difficult for any political party or movement growing out of her ideas to grapple with the very real need for compromise in politics. Rand considered compromise evil. Now, this brings us to some of the paradoxes of Rand. She's been deeply inspirational to a segment of her readers, deeply inspirational in very overtly political ways. But it's hard to translate that politics or that inspiration into workaday politics. It's sort of a fundamental question about ideology, right? The ideology has to be extreme to get noticed and to survive, but something has to happen for it to be translated into effective change on the ground. And part of the issue with Rand is that she really hasn't been subject to interpretation. Her legacy has been jealously guarded by a closely knit cult of true believers who made it sort of so unpleasant to deal with Rand that very few people want to bother. Now this had started changing when I began my project, but it was still something I had to grapple with a bit. If she's going to become the Karl Marx of the right, her ideas will need to be more widely reshaped and used in different ways and transformed. Now, the growing popularity of her in Republican circles today suggests this might be happening. And in my book, I argue that the historical significance of Rand is not her narrow philosophy of objectivism, which was too confining and too dogmatic to hold people for very long, but it's the reinterpretation, or it's the taking of certain fundamentals of Rand and applying them in a different context. We go back. A key example of this would be Alan Greenspan. He started as a very devout follower of Rand. He was a regular in her Saturday night salons in New York during the 1950s. And he remained close to her as he began accepting posts in the government. Here he is being sworn in by President Ford as the head of the Council of Economic Advisors. He's invited his mom, who's being hugged by the president, and he's invited Ayn Rand and her husband Frank O'Connor. These are the people he wants with him as he takes this step. But it's very significant that Greenspan chose the Republican Party rather than the Libertarian Party to make his mark. He built on a Randian foundation, yet he moved away from formal objectivism. And this is emblematic of how Rand's influence has spread. You'll notice that I didn't talk much about objectivism in this talk, and it's because I really think it's among the least important of the things that Rand did, considered as a whole. More significant, I think, is her fictional celebration of capitalism and individualism, the way she recognized a set of pre-existing American values and beliefs centering around individualism and economics, and she gave them new life. She set them in a new context that can still be grasped onto today. Now, stepping back, how does putting Rand into the story change our understanding of American history or American thought? I think one of the major things she does is highlight the ongoing presence of individualistic and libertarian ideas. These are typically understood as part of the conservative synthesis, but they have their own independent existence. And they go back, although I've talked a lot about the 60s today, they go back much further. They go back into the 30s. They go back even more. And we can think about Rand as an outsider to this country coming in the 20s, coming to political consciousness in the 30s, finding this older tradition, reworking it in her own ways, plugging it into more of a modernist sensibility, featuring modern architecture, some very strange sexual politics that include some retrograde and some progressive elements, but are nonetheless catchy, and mass marketing it in these very compelling novels that have continued to sell well after her death. So she's sort of a translator of this ideological tradition from one century into the other. Now, Rand's career also highlights a shift in 20th century political thought from a radicalism of the left that was dominant in the 1930s to a radicalism of the right that became dominant in the 1960s and may even be said to be dominant today. There was a lot of discussion of ideological exhaustion on the left at mid-century, but clearly there's not much ideological exhaustion on the right even today. Rand has formulated an ideology of capitalism that has proved enormously compelling. It has its pitfalls as a political ideology, but as I said, it gets the process started. It's a gateway drug that continues to draw people in. Now, the history of her encounter with libertarians suggests it's not an easy process to take the ideas that Rand has and to make them work outside of the fictional settings she created. But the new willingness to embrace her on the right, even the new willingness to embrace her by religious conservatives, from Limbaugh to Glenn Beck, suggests that this process is ongoing, that it's gathering steam, and that if so, we may be just at the beginning of Rand's influence. Thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to take questions.
Thanks for that. One thing that really struck me about this presentation of it was your emphasis on kind of Rand as a sort of cult figure for the formation of a counterculture on the right. And we've written, or other people have written, I've read a lot about the counterculture on the left, and parsing out exactly what the difference is between SDS and the kind of more mainstream liberal establishment is not always clear. I mean, there's some continuities between the two, but it seems like there are some factors that push the student movement away from the liberal establishment. So, if we just talk a little bit about what are the kind of things that push the followers of Rand away from the conservative establishment, away from Buckley and toward the thing that Rand did. It seems to be a less kind of powerful push, at least initially.
Yeah, well, let me just say I think it's really fruitful to think about, I emphasize the right aspect of Rand, but it's fruitful to put this into a larger story of youth activism and youth awareness in the 1960s, and to think of the New Left and the New Right as both reactions against liberalism, against mainstream liberalism versus dissatisfaction. So what pushes them? Part of it is that the right, as much of the left, is participating in this anti-authoritarianism of the 1960s. And conservatism becomes a way, especially on campuses where people feel there's a dominant liberal consensus, to sort of thumb your nose at the establishment. And particularly because professors hate Ayn Rand, like nothing else. And I found literally professors who would say, if you turn in a paper on Ayn Rand, you will automatically fail this course. And story after story of objectivists getting up and reciting the John Galt Oath to sort of skeptical professors. So there's part of it that they're drawn to it because they have this they're sharing in this sort of zeitgeist of rebellion, of wanting to move away from authority, but Rand gives them a way to move away from authority, to in some ways move away. I would say religion is another key piece of it, to say, I'm not religious anymore, I'm an atheist, but I'm still in a very clear ethical world, and to say, hey mom and dad, I think we should get out of Vietnam, but to still say, my ideology says I should get a job and I should make money and I should succeed. So it's a different form of rebellion. It's more of a low-stakes rebellion. And I think one of the ways you could put Rand into the story is Todd Gitlin has this famous quote, the right marched on Washington while the left marched on the English department, right? And I think Rand is part of the story in that she fed a rebellion that was very within the mainstream bounds of success and respectability. Despite it feeling rebellious, it wasn't in many ways rebellious at all because it didn't ask people to leave commercial society. So I think that's part of it. And I would say religion is a key piece. A lot of her followers, you didn't have enough good data on this. The data that I had suggested they had slightly lower income levels than members of the New Left, but a lot of anecdotal evidence. There were a lot of Catholics and there were a lot of Jews. And Catholic students found the same kind of moral orthodoxy in objectivism that they would have been exposed to in Catholicism. So it's this feeling, I'm breaking free, but you're just kind of bound in the same type of ideology. And for Jewish students, I think it's very straightforward. This was a way to be on the right without being religiously conservative or religiously Christian. It provided another way. So those are some thoughts I have on that question. Yeah?
I have a question about the substance of Rand's philosophy, and this may be sort of prompted by my own ignorance of Rand. I'm another professor who hasn't read her. But what I'm sort of intrigued by as I listen to your presentation and think about the tumultuous period in which Rand thought and wrote, is the question of whether Rand has a theory of history. You made a comparison in passing to Marx, and I'm sort of troubled by this question. Does she have a theory of how history is developing and what its likely trajectories are? Or might it rather be that the absence of a theory of history in Rand's writing is what helps us to explain her appeal?
No, she absolutely does have a theory of history. And the theory of history is this. History is shaped most fundamentally by the ideas people hold. And the problems of the West have been caused by altruism. Altruism is what made it possible for the Soviet government to confiscate property for the greater good of the whole. Altruism, she saw Nazism as just another species of totalitarianism. Altruism makes you say, you as an individual are not important, the whole is important. So essentially, that's one theory, altruism. It's also interwoven with the move away from the move to sort of ethical relativism. We moved away from ideas of absolute truth. We sort of started with Aristotle, and it's been all downhill from there. And the way history changes is intellectuals change history. So the first book she published after Atlas Shrugged was a compilation of her other work called For the New Intellectual. And it had a long essay that said, there need to be new intellectuals. And the old intellectuals got it wrong. They were suckered into the left, into Marxism. What the new intellectuals have to do is broker between the inventions and the creativity of a capitalist society and explain this and justify it to the broader culture. So students reading this would say, this is me, this is who I can be one of these new intellectuals. So she absolutely had a theory of history, and she would sort of rush into politics, very enthusiastic about Goldwater, sort of heartbroken, same dynamic with Wilkie, and then she'd say, I forgot myself, it's earlier than we think. First we have to change the ideas, then we can change the politics. And this has led organized objectivism to hold, seminars and support, graduate students and professors and not want to interact with the broader world, and I think there's a bit of a loosening of that. But yeah, very robust theory of history. History is, it's a sort of decline, but there's still hope for the future if you follow my ideology and you spread it. So that's part of the power of the ideas. It does comprehensive explanation. Yes?
Yes. Thank you very much. I read maybe the first third or less of the book up to the point where the writer as philosopher or something to that. So I got those early years, and I appreciate that very much. One impression I got from it, and maybe you could correct it, is that she seemed to have an unusual number of newspaper people around her, columnists and that sort of thing. And I'm trying to read into that a publicist mentality that ends up on the right. There's, like Fox News or something, where they're much more conscious of the necessity of programmatic propaganda, get it out there, message. Can we attribute that to her consorting with the newspaper people, or is that just kind of marginal?
I think it's more a symptom of this whole broader trend on the right. So she was one of the first people in the 30s to say the left has won the battle of ideas, and more so the battle of propaganda. She said again and again, people are so saturated with this pink propaganda that they can't think straight. So what we have to do is create books and magazines that will turn the tide. And she started saying this in the early 40s. Now this theme becomes picked up a lot more in the early 50s, and that's sort of the idea behind Buckley's founding of National Review, that I'm going to create a magazine that's going to be, mainstream and intellectually rigorous, and I'm going to weed out all the marginal, sort of sketchy anti-Semitism and other stuff that's kept the right on the fringe and make it more respectable. So I think Rand was part of a larger sense that the battle of ideas had to be fought on a number of different ways. Her choice was culture, popular culture, which really attracted me because I happen to like kind of cheesy novels and bad film and this kind of thing, but it was a lot of business people were also fighting this battle, and Rand was picked up and used by them in the early years to spread the sort of gospel of the free market, and then they found other ways to do it because she was a very difficult person to work with. So, yes?
I'm kind of stuck a little bit. I liked your
think you made an analogy between that Ayn Rand is sort of the Karl Marx of the right.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how far one can take that, because Karl Marx, he had a lot of influence on academic thought, on intelligentsia and so on for decades and so much. Is there anything comparable in Ayn Rand that would kind of part to substantiate an analogy you make?
Right.
If there's any more you could add to that.
Let me think of how I would sort of develop that. One problem with Rand is that she hasn't penetrated into the academy very well. So if we're looking at that trajectory of Marx currently, that doesn't hold true, although some people come and say to me, they kind of whisper, there's a lot more of us out there than you know. I'm in philosophy and almost, they claim anybody studying Aristotle got there through Rand. Yeah, I don't really know, because there has been such a bias against her. I think where you see Rand taking hold is not so much the, sort of, if we're going to define intelligentsia as intellectuals, I think we find it more among the political elite. So people, organizers, and people who've gone into think tanks. I mean, in the think tank world, so many people that came in through Rand. But they chose to go to think tanks. Partially it could be because Rand just railed against universities and professors again and again and again, so that, that wasn't the life of the mind she taught didn't really have much to do with universities in the United States. It had to do with, being a creative person or creating a business.
Could I just add one thing to that? Marx, again, you could say had a strong international component, right? It wasn't just German or Russian and so on. And is there a parallel for Ayn Rand? Is it go beyond the United States in any significant sense?
It's interesting. So there's some purchase of her work in Britain, sort of part of the Thatcherite movement. She spins differently in different countries. So I do have a scholar from Switzerland coming to UVA to work on this very question. What's her influence in continental Europe? But I found, for instance, in my research, she's huge in India. Like, there are copies of her works all on the sidewalks in India. And so I talked to a bunch of Indians about that, and they uniformly told me the same thing. India is a very conformist culture with there's heavy burdens of duty to family and to religion. And when you're, 17 and you discover Howard Rourke in the Fountainhead, it's this tremendous moment of freedom. And I went through Bollywood stars and Indian footballers. They all say Ayn Rand is their favorite author. So there she's playing in a very different way. That's the personal liberationist aspect of her that's coming out, not so much the politics. Although I also spoke to someone who has a free market think tank in India who is an objectivist and is working and has got all kinds of funding to try to spread these ideas. So I don't know too much about it. There's some presence, but I don't think she's spread as much as some other sort of the more formalized free market economics has. Yeah, in the back.
One of the things that's really interesting about the history of 20th century intellectual history is the way that ex-communists, the role that they play in delegitimizing communism. And so I'm curious if there are ex-Randians and if they have, if there is some kind of cohort that has a moment where they think, oh my God, there's some moment of disillusionment that they realize that they've been trapped inside some sort of bizarre universe that has unrealistic moral and political assumptions buried in it.
This is such a great question that I'm fascinated by this trajectory of left to right, and Rand wasn't part of that trajectory, which she used to advantage to say, I've been consistent from the beginning, although she did draw on her communist life experience. So I have talked to a lot of people who've moved away from Ayn Rand, but they almost all retain some type of affection for her, and they're not interested in denouncing her. And a lot of them come to me and say, thank you so much for helping me get clear on what was going on in this part of my life when I was obsessed with her. And there's so much that's not in Rand's philosophy that with a few years of life experience, just having children, how does that fit into, and all of that, people hit that. So most of them move away, but most of them had this moment with her that was so intense that they're not willing to denounce it the way that the ex-communists were, and to sort of use it then as a career-building strategy. So, that I think is this question of why is there this well-worn path from left to right, and why are so many relatively fewer people going the other way? And you know, maybe there'll be more commentary, more denunciations of her, but right now, like I said, I mean, and when I talk to people about their encounter with Rand, mostly younger students, I mean, they become visibly emotional. So she strikes people so deeply that there's this kind of lingering like to her. Although someone did send me an ad from Craig, a friend found an ad on Craigslist that was like, I'm giving away all my Ayn Rand books because they ruined my life. So, yes.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I wanted to ask you, do you see her as at all charismatic? I mean, she is one of the really few, I guess, people attached really incredible presences on the American, as you see her attacking the stage. With the fact that, you know, so many of the leaders were men, and she was a woman, and despite this kind of nurturing role, she just self-actualization. I mean,
Yeah.
She
She definitely struck people with a lot of power as a charismatic personality. She had absolute certainty she was right. And this really, really impressed people, you know, and say, I feel like I found the answers, you know, and she would have an answer for everything and absolutely no trace of self-doubt. Now, definitely some people found that terrifying and beelined away from her, but, you know, a lot of people were drawn to her for that reason. And she had a very mysterious persona. She would wear a cape, you know, and a $ pin, and she smoked a cigarette in a holder, and everywhere she went, she had an entourage with her. So she definitely cultivated this aura of mystery, and objectivism was a very hierarchical society as it developed in New York. Like, if she met you and, you know, found you favorable, she might invite you to the Saturday night salon, and you could come, but you couldn't, like, bring your friends. You know, it was this, so part of that was in her, for sure, and the gender thing, I think, was a big part of it, because it made her, it was just like an odd element for people. It made young women very interested in her, and made young men very interested in her, just because it was so different. But I think in terms of the development of the cult of personality around her, Nathaniel Branden played a really big role in that, in sort of enabling her, and then in creating this hierarchy, because then he was number 2. So he had every interest in kind of encrusting this hierarchy in the same way. But yeah, a few people were very off-put by her. One of the few people who really did not buy her at all was Sidney Hook. I was looking at his papers, and he's like, she didn't seem like she was listening to me. She was waiting for me to stop talking so she could start talking again. And so he was not at all impressed with her. But almost every other eyewitness account that's made it into print is favorable. So I really had to look to find the unfavorable, because not a lot of people wrote down the unfavorable, they just wrote down the favorable. But yeah, there's definitely some, I mean, she's a very, very unusual person, and people picked up on that, and some were drawn to it very powerfully. Yes?
Hey, just as sort of a side note, my father is a big reader of Ayn Rand.
Okay.
He's actually one of the people that was trying to move to New Hampshire. And
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I read this Wall Street Journal piece earlier this week,
Mhm.
and they were making an analogy between Barney Frank and the character of Wellesley Mooch in Atlas Shrugged, and also between Hank Rearden and Bill Gates. And I'm wondering how you think Ayn Rand would regard Bill Gates's, obviously the parallel here is the antitrust issues, but how Ayn Rand would regard Bill Gates's charitable work, his foundation and that sort of thing, and if that is inconsistent with the altruism, or if she would regard that as like, what's his personal choice, he decides how to spend his money.
No, she carved out a place for charity under that very logic. Well, if it's of value to you to be charitable, then it's okay. But nobody should tell you to be charitable, and nobody should define the moral life according to charity. So she might give him a pass on that. I think it's his father more so than he who's been involved in the issue of the inheritance tax and saying, like, you know, we're ready to pay it. You know, there should be an inheritance tax, and that would make her blood boil, because she really thought that was simply confiscation. If you earned a lot of money, you should keep all of it. So I think she'd have mixed feelings about Bill Gates, and I think what she'd be most frustrated about, she really thought it was important for businessmen who succeeded in a capitalist society to go out and promote capitalism. And to spread ideas that made them successful. So John Allison is the head of BB&T, who's a big Ayn Rand believer and is given all kinds of money away and gives Atlas Shrugged away on college campuses. He would be kind of her model. And Bill Gates, I think she would respect his achievements, but say, I bet she would say something along the lines of, he thinks he's doing good for the world with these charitable works, but he would do a lot more good if he would spread ideas of free market capitalism. I bet that's what she'd say. So I'm getting pretty good, scarily enough, at channeling Ayn Rand, so it's my best guess. Yeah.
I wonder if, some of the doubt that academics have about Ayn Rand comes about in part because you start out thinking about how Ayn Rand came about, her philosophy that came out of her writing, or was the philosophy there before she wrote a book?
Well, let me just quickly answer the L. Ron Hubbard analogy. The main difference between them, there's many differences, but the most important is that she drank her own Kool-Aid, She believed in her own philosophy. She didn't create it cynically for the manipulation of other people. So the philosophy versus novelist is a huge problem. And it's a huge problem for her taking her work and trying to make hay with it in the real world, because it's a rigorous and highly unrealistic fictional world where there's no people who with any type of dependency, physical or mental. There's very few children. There's none of that. And she struggled with being a philosopher or being a novelist. And so after she wrote Atlas Shrugged, she became she had a few students who studied philosophy with her who were telling her, you're the greatest thinker ever, and it's all downhill from Aristotle on, and you have a real contribution to make. So she made she wrote a few essays on philosophy. That there's a group of philosophers who take those very seriously and are trying to build on them. That wasn't really the question that I was curious about or really wanted to answer. I think there's many problems that academics have with her. I think part of it's the tone. They're very angry books. They're very dismissive, and she was a difficult person to study in some ways because she picks up a lot of ideas that are in circulation and uses them, but she doesn't, like a more traditional intellectual, explicitly engage with the thought and works of other people and sort of carry on long-running arguments with them. She'll take something and run off in her own direction. So I think it's been hard to figure out, how do I approach her, how do I set her in a broader context, and how do I tie her to other people. That was the challenge for me in this project, and one of the reasons I focused on the political activism that came out of her work. But I think novels are an underappreciated vehicle for political philosophy. I really think they are. It's people read them and absorb the ideas without realizing they're doing so. And 500,000 people bought this book. I don't know how many of them finished it in 2009, but that's a lot of people being exposed to this set of ideas. And I don't know how many well-argued political treatises would reach that type of mass audience. So another challenge for me is, how do you take ideas that are really simplified for broad appeal? How do you speak about those in a sophisticated and serious manner? How do you engage with them without kind of being dragged down to their levels? So that was fun for me to do that, to take this and say, this isn't just a pulp novel. Like, there's some really serious ideology that has some really serious consequences embedded within it, and trying to pull that out. David?
Your work reminds us that one of the striking things about Ayn Rand is the number and extent of institutionally and intellectually powerful elites that tried to destroy her but failed. Because if you go from Buckley and Chambers and these people, different kinds of right-wingers, different sorts of libertarians that had objections to her, through centrist political figures, through the left, through the far left, then you talk about the philosophers, you talk about the literary critics, you talk about popular journalists who write about literature but understand how bad she is. There aren't very many people, I think, that have sustained their popularity, not simply with elites ignoring them, but with elites systematically attacking them for 60, 70 years. Now, I know that you've been focusing more on Rand's appeal and how it is that she develops her appeal. And I don't recall from your book whether you discussed this or not, but I would be interested in your reflections on the failure of her enemies. Is there something systemic? Is there something in common between all these people that would have liked to have destroyed her but didn't, when they really have so much power that they were unable to mobilize successfully?
Yeah, to some degree, she's like the Hydra. Like, you chop off the head and two grow. because, and this was really clear in the 60s, to have your professor denounce Ayn Rand was like, made her all the more attractive, and to have your parents think she's dangerous and your pastor worry you might be losing religion, all that just makes her more and more interesting. And that's sort of continued in the internet era. I mean, you know, it's all about getting eyeballs and having debate, and, you know, there's like whole subcultures out there that revolve around arguing around Ayn Rand on the internet. I mean, these people spend all day doing this, you know, and so they love nothing more than a battle. So when people come and start attacking her, that just like invigorates their sense of purpose. So that's a lot of it, that dynamic. The more she's attacked, and people perceive the attacks on her to be unfair, because they're often very loaded with animus. And I think a lot of the people who attack her aren't noticing how deeply she moves people in a sort of personal, it feels like, you know, kind of like a first love or a special relationship that people are very protective of. And, you know, I've seen this when I've talked to students. I mean, I've seen them sort of, as they try to explain what Ayn Rand means to them, some of them are almost like shaking. You know, it's so important to them, and that kind of person is never going to be okay with a denigration of it. So there's this way she hits people in this core of the self, and then there's the just joy of argument that she's kept on. But she's also tapping into, a lot of people feel this, you know, she taps into ideas, and people say, I always had these ideas, I just never knew how to articulate them. You know, this very American idea that success that you achieve, you bootstrapped your way up. You know, you did it yourself, this reluctance to look sort of systematically and structurally, and this fondness for individual analysis, she taps into that. So.
Would it be fair to say then that almost without exception, her critics lacked the capacity for empathic identification with those people that were really involved in it, and therefore the responses that they made, however empirically and conceptually well-grounded, lacked the right diplomacy. And if only they would have earnestly sat down with these people instead of just sort of dumping on them, they might have more success, or is that also a fantasy?
I mean, to some degree, that characterizes the approach that I took to this project, which is there's already, you know, 6 books out there telling you all the evils of Ayn Rand, and it helped that I had a friend from college who was an extremely brilliant person, and he had gone through the Ayn Rand phase at 14 or 15, and he, you know, he was very protective of her, you know, and had moved far beyond her, but was someone who's just intellectual capacity I respected so much that helped check my snide impulses whenever they arose. So I don't know how much headway you make with these things. I think a lot of people self-correct in terms of they read and eventually think this isn't really a comprehensive philosophy. There's a lot missing. But if they lose that first impression, I think most of them don't. That's the significance of it. Yes.
So, as you mentioned earlier, that Ayn Rand sees capitalism as the only moral and practical system, and she's very sort of utopian about the consequences of it. Whereas, you know, often rights are something more complex. That protection of freedom of speech means tolerance for hate speech, and you find that libertarianism and the American right is sort of persistent in that utopian view of it, or allows for more complex understanding of the consequences of free market capitalism?
I think they're still following a lot of the ways Rand saw the world. And one thing I would highlight is this lack of contingency and chance in the world that's a byproduct of the tightly plotted fiction she wrote. So there's no scenario where somebody works really hard and is earning a living and, you know, is in some accident and is paralyzed and can no longer earn a living and for whatever reason doesn't have family members who can support them. That person, that scenario is just not in the book. And so that's not in the libertarian theory a lot. So, you know, it's all about voluntary. There's very little consideration of what if there's gaps in what voluntary treatment can do, or what if there's situations in which people are genuinely not responsible for the conditions that they find themselves in. Because it's always responsible, because in Ayn Rand's fictional world, everybody embodies an idea. And there's nobody embodying the idea that, like, you know, stuff happens. Okay, 2 more questions. Anyone? I heard from you already. Anyone else? But happy to hear from you again.
I'm wondering if you would consider
Yeah.
So it has something to do with and
So-
how you would characterize his relationship. I read his memoir, and that
Uh-huh.
was the impression it got from that, and how you would characterize his relationship today.
So Brandon as ex-Randian, absolutely. One of the really interesting things about Brandon, I didn't really follow this thread, is he went on to become a best-selling writer of self-esteem books. And his books have sold like millions of copies each, and he sort of pioneered this pop self-esteem. So I feel like there's another really interesting story to be told about the rise of self-esteem. And he said quite explicitly that a lot of his writing is to undo the harm he did while, he pioneered objectivist psychology, which is about the most destructive form of psychology one can imagine, because it teaches you to master your emotions with rationality. And so then once he figured out how damaging that was, he did a lot of unwinding of it. But yeah, it's still all, it's about self-esteem, and it's about your relationship with yourself. There's, as opposed to say a gestalt perspective. So that's been very popular, and it's still ongoing. And now he's basically, talk about being a second-hander. He's like the ultimate second-hander as far as I can say. He's still shilling Rand stuff. He's an iPhone app with a self-esteem quote you can get once a day, all this stuff. So he's made a very good living off of Ayn Rand. Did you have a question?
I was wondering, so how your book is received by people who are still devotees of Ayn Rand, and also I was curious about how you gained access to her information, to her archives, and why.
So the archives is kind of a mystery how I actually got in there. David Hollinger in the back, we sent a letter on fancy letterhead saying I was a brilliant student who'd like access to these archives, and they said, okay. It was kind of amazing. And now I realize there's kind of an era of glasnost in the Ayn Rand archives where they were realizing their approach of promoting her ideas. What they used to do was send Leonard Peikoff's book on objectivism to the head of every philosophy department with a letter saying this is like groundbreaking new work, and it would go in the circular file right away. And so they sort of just realized they had to be open to more approaches. So, and I had no objectivist past. I was like, I don't know much, I'm curious. They thought that I would do what I did, which was write a book that would bring more people, teach more people about her. So there's that in terms of the access. In terms of the response, it was very tricky to get. I was very paranoid for years, would I be able to publish, because they have all the rights, and that went okay. And I called it, they're sort of orthodox and neo-objectivist. The neo-objectivists love me because they love talking about Ayn Rand's faults as much as anything. So they love it. The orthodox, I have heard that there's some listservs where if you admit to having read my book, you're not allowed on the listserv. These objectivist discussions. So most of them haven't read it because that would be the real orthodox. Rand was really big on not sanctioning evil, and so to read my book would be to sanction my book in some way. So a lot of them have avoided reading it. I did get one of the head honchos to read it. He came and saw me do a talk on Greenspan at Columbia, and the whole front row was like objectivists, dressed to the nines, like hanging on every word, and they were like, oh, we loved your talk. We're actually going to try reading your book. And then a couple weeks later, I got a forward of his email to his listserv denouncing it. So they're very big on private listservs, and so they don't like it. And one of the main things they don't like is that I don't talk about her as a philosopher. I miss the whole point, I don't talk about her philosophy, which is her big contribution, and that's not how I see it as a historian. So I don't talk about it, and I just don't even go there, and so that frustrates them. But on balance, I was a lot more worried about like crazy people being really upset than actually happened. Like the internet kind of took a lot. It's all out there on the internet, so I didn't have to deal with it face to face, which was nice. So.
On behalf of the center and our audience, I'd like to thank you. This was a wonderful presentation.